Today I'm going to demonstrate how to use the table saw to make 4 common cuts in woodworking. These cuts are the rip cut, the cross cut, the miter cut, and the bevel cut. I'm also going to show you some safety tips along the way and show you different parts of the table saw. My name is James and you have found Homestyle Woodcrafts. Welcome. Okay, quick introduction to the parts of the table saw. This is the table part of the table saw, this flat surface. This is where your workpiece will rest. This is the rip fence. This is where the blade is. This is the blade guard. This is the miter fence, and it runs in either of these miter slots. Below the level of the table saw surface, we have the on-off switch, the blade height adjustment, and the blade angle adjustment. The table saw has known safety risks. These include the blade kickback, which is when it kicks a piece of wood back at you, the dust that it makes when you're cutting wood, and the noise. Fortunately, there are known safety measures that you can take to mitigate these risks. So you don't have to fear using a table saw, but you do need to respect it and employ safety measures. Let's start with personal safety gear. You should use eyeglasses, hearing protection, and a respirator. There are also tools to use to keep your hands away from the blade, but also keep your workpiece secure. These include push blocks and push sticks. You can buy these or you can make these. And they don't have to be expensive. None of the safety gear has to be overly expensive. But it's a lot less expensive than dealing with an injury. Got to keep these guys safe. Most table saws will come with a common set of safety features, including a blade guard, which will help prevent accidental contact with the saw blade, a splitter or something similar called a riving knife that sits behind the blade. What these do is help prevent the workpiece from pinching either side of the saw blade. If your workpiece were to pinch on the back side of the saw blade, your chances of it getting kicked back towards you increase. There's also these anti-kickback pawls. These have sharp points on them so that when you run your workpiece by them, they would dig into the wood and help prevent kickback. Let's make our first cut, and we're going to start with a rip cut. The purpose of the rip cut is to cut your workpiece to the width that you want. You do that by adjusting the distance between the fence and the saw blade. So I've marked where I want to cut the wood. So I'm going to adjust the rip fence so that the saw blade will cut the wood where I want it. Keeping in mind that the space cut out in the wood by the width of the saw blade will impact the cut. So you need to account for that. That space is called kerf. When you're making the cut, it's important that you keep good control over your workpiece, or that could be a safety hazard if you don't. So you need to make sure that it's being pushed up against the fence, down against the table, and moving forward. You can do that by using push blocks and push sticks or a combination. I'm going to be using a combination. I'm going to use the push block to keep the workpiece pushed down and moving forward. And I'm going to use the push stick to exert force that way against the fence. I'm only going to do that before the wood reaches the blade. If I were to put that force up here, it could cause the wood to pinch the blade and result in kickback. Don't want to do that. So it's going to look like this. I'm going to push it on through. Make sure that when you have your rip fence in place to lock it down, adjust the height of the saw blade so it's just a little bit higher than the piece of wood you're cutting. It's a good idea not to stand directly in line with your workpiece. That way, if there is kickback, you're not in the line of fire. Let's move on to the crosscut. The purpose of the crosscut is to cut your piece of wood down to the length that you want, and it's usually across the grain of the wood. Here's an example of a piece of wood marked for a crosscut. To make a crosscut, we'll put the miter gauge in place and we'll move the rip fence out of the way. To make the crosscut, secure your piece of wood up against the miter gauge with your hand or with a clamp, and keeping your hands well away from the blade, move the workpiece toward the blade. If you want additional support, you can make a fence for your miter gauge using the slots in the miter gauge and attaching it like so, and then you would tighten these screws down so that the fence was secure. You can also buy aftermarket miter gauges that have fences built into them. It can be tempting when you need to make repeated cuts of the same size to set your rip fence to accomplish that. But don't do this because it's not a safe practice. If you were to do this and you move your piece forward, this cutoff piece could get trapped between the fence and the blade and get kicked back to you. A safer alternative is to set up a stop block prior to the blade. You would clamp it to your fence, like so, and then set your fence to the desired measurement. And then, as you move it forward, there's more room between the fence and the blade, and your workpiece is a lot less likely to get kicked back towards you. The next cut is the miter cut. It is similar to the cross cut, except it's a cut angled across the piece of the wood, looking something like this. This cut is used to create a certain shape, to create a certain appearance, or to join it to other pieces of wood, say like if you were making a frame. We can make this cut by adjusting the miter gauge to the angle we want, and then cutting it like we did with the cross cut. On many miter gauges, you can adjust it to the angle you want by loosening this knob, pulling this pin, and making the adjustment. Then tighten the knob back down and push the pin in. Once you have the angle set on the miter gauge that you want, you can put your piece of wood in place and make the cut. The last cut I'm going to demonstrate is a bevel cut, which is an angled cut across the face of the wood. And for my purpose, this will be the face of the wood, and so I'm going to make a bevel cut along here. This would be a form of a cross cut because it's going across the grain. However, I could do a bevel cut here, and this would be the face of my cut, but this would be the long way, and so it would take the form of a rip cut. For either of these kind of bevel cuts, you would angle your saw blade. I'm going to demonstrate both of them for you. First step, change the angle of the blade. When you make these cuts on your table saw, make sure you're familiar with the safety features of your particular tool, and I recommend that you read the owner's manual to make sure you know how to operate it safely. Be sure to watch this next video because I think it's one you're really going to like. Now go have some fun. Thanks for watching.